I'm going to talk to you about financing a Green New Deal. That's the title, although I'm not going to talk a lot about finance, as you can probably imagine. So the motivation for the paper that the talk is based on was obviously the Green New Deal being thrown into the national conversation, both here and in Europe, and then, of course, mainstream economists doing their own accounting for how much it was going to cost. So we wanted to do an MMT sort of analysis of the Green New Deal and how to pay for it, or the affordability. Now, before I go into that, I just wanted to, come back to this question that Stephanie kind of started with, right? So during the pandemic, the Congress appropriated about $5 trillion. Where did we find the money? That's not a sort of mystery anymore. The government simply spent it into existence. Congress appropriated, the Treasury spent, and the Fed ensured that the Treasury's ability to do so. What was difficult? Well, what was difficult was finding real stuff to buy with the money. And that was especially true earlier in the pandemic, right? We did not have enough ventilators. We did not have enough personal protective equipment and masks, right? We had stories of the US sort of stealing the shipments destined for Europe and diverting them to the United States, right? So in a situation like that, it doesn't matter how much money you have, right? The government had all the money in the world and it could throw it out at the economy, but if there wasn't real stuff to buy, then you couldn't buy what didn't exist, right? So I think that's an important lesson that we should learn from the pandemic. Now, let's talk about the Green New Deal and sort of apply the same logic to the Green New Deal. Well, what is the Green New Deal? The Green New Deal is supposed to be like the New Deal, the original New Deal, which was a comprehensive set of reforms implemented in the US during the Great Depression. The Green New Deal tries to do the same thing. It takes the same comprehensive approach to reforming the economy, seeing a bunch of issues in the economy and arguing that they are related, right? They're interrelated, and the solutions sort of have to come in a comprehensive package rather than in a piecemeal approach. Well, different people include different things in the Green New Deal. The version that we looked at was the most comprehensive version of it. So it included greening the economy over a period of 10 years, universal health care, something like Medicare for all in the context of the United States. Obviously, if you are doing something like this for European nations, you don't have to worry about that because most of them have some sort of universal health care already. It included a job guarantee, other things like universal child care, free or subsidized college, as well as ending the forever wars. Now I'm going to concentrate on the first three of these: greening the economy, universal health care, and the job guarantee. So what was the mainstream approach to this? The mainstream approach was, well, let's estimate how much it's going to cost financially. And there was this outrageous estimate that came from the American I don't remember the name of the think tank. It was some kind of a conservative think tank run by the previous chair of the CBO. And their estimate was it's going to cost us $93 trillion. And most of it came from the job guarantee and universal health care, actually. Greening the economy was the cheapest part of this. And they added up all the costs. They sort of admit that this is not a good way to do it because there will be sort of the spillover effect, but still that's the way they do it. And then they calculate this pay-fors, the tax increases that you have to do to pay for the $93 trillion. And obviously it's confiscatory. You cannot raise taxes so much. So they say, well, you can do it. The problem is that a lot of economists who we would call progressive economists engage in similar kind of analysis. They might have different estimates, right? They might include certain things, exclude others, but the methodology was the same. How much it's going to cost, and then what kind of taxes are we going to raise to pay for this kind of spending. So people from Perry, for example, had a paper on Medicare for all. How much is it going to cost? And then how is the government going to pay for it? That's what they were trying to do. Now, the MMT approach is obviously different. And Paul Krugman, I think, wrote in the New York Times saying that, well, heterodoxy doesn't really help. I think he meant MMT by that, because you have to raise taxes anyway, even if it's about inflation and it's not a pay for, taxes still have to go up. Well, as I will argue here, it does matter what approach you take to it, because then even your approach to taxes is going to be different, because if you're approaching them as pay-fors versus as, creating room for room in the real economy in terms of resources, then you're going to have a different approach to taxation. So the MMT approach is that nations with sovereign currency have the financial means to afford whatever is technologically feasible. So J. Foster, he was a famous institutional economist. This quote from him perfectly encapsulates the MMT approach. Whatever is technologically possible is financially feasible. So the focus should not be on finance. It should really be on technology and on resources. Do we have the technology to transition to green economies? And do we have a green economy? And do we have the resources to do that? That's really the question. So that's what really determines the affordability of a program like the Green New Deal. And if we take this approach, all of these programs are obviously financially, they're going to cost us financially. But if you take this real resource approach, then you see that some of the programs are actually a source of resources. They don't cost us in terms of resources. In fact, they release resources which can be used for other parts of the Green New Deal. And I'll go into detail into all of that. So from the MMT perspective, the real question is, how do we find the resources? If we don't have enough, how do we create them? That's really the question that economists should be worrying about, and not tax increases. All right. So one way to look at whether we can afford the Green New Deal from a real resource perspective is obviously to use the potential GDP, right? So you could always say, well, I mean, it's simplifying somewhat, right? But if your economy is somewhere here, right, you're way below your potential, then you have a lot of room in your economy to increase spending in a non-inflationary manner, right? So you can't be somewhere here and say, well, we can't afford to spend more, we can't afford to green the economy, right? We can't afford to engage in spending if you're here, because you have all this room in your economy to increase spending, because there are all of those idle resources. Now, if you're closer to your potential, right? And again, we can debate about the issues with potential GDP. Is it really a good estimate of the productive capacity of the economy? We can debate that. But if you're closer to your potential GDP, then we have to think about, what are some of these offsets that you have to engage in if you want to inject more spending into the economy. Obviously, there needs to be more planning, right? Strategic planning, let's call it that, because that's more acceptable. Creating more resources, releasing the spending when resources become available, and that kind of stuff. All right. Now, so from this real resource accounting perspective, the question that we try to answer in this paper is, how much of our resources do we need to devote to the Green New Deal? And obviously, if you just look at it from a financial perspective, that doesn't tell us anything. And as I will argue throughout, one advantage of a comprehensive program like the Green New Deal is that it might free up resources just when you need them, right? And it will not leave resources idle, because as we will see, some of these programs are deflationary. In other words, they free up resources. If you're going to free up resources and not use them, then that's a problem as well, because then you can create unemployment. Okay, so the three parts that I said I was going to concentrate on: greening the economy over 10 years, universal healthcare, and job guarantee. Well, are these going to require resources, or are these going to free up resources? And the answer is they might do both, right? So greening the economy, obviously you're going to need to devote a lot of your resources to, build more renewable energy capacity, whether it's solar panels or wind turbines or whatever, you include in that renewable energy sources. So you're going to need more resources for that. You're going to need more people, more materials, right? All of that. At the same time, though, you're going to be spending less on fossil fuels. So you're going to be investing less in fossil fuels, right? And you're going to gradually phase them out, which means you're going to need fewer and fewer workers, for instance, who are going to be working in a fossil fuel industry. In fact, that's one of the arguments against, right, transitioning to greening. The argument is that what are we going to do with all of these workers who are going to be unemployed because they're not going to be working on pipelines and refineries and so on and so forth, right? So that's seen as a problem with greening. Well, so on the one hand, you need people to green the economy. On the other hand, you're freeing them up, right? Because you don't need to use them in fossil fuel industry. So in a way, it's both a source of resources and a use of resources. On net, we estimate that it's going to require more resources. Universal healthcare, as I will argue, is going to be a source of resources because our aggregate spending on healthcare will decrease, and a job guarantee is going to do both, right? So our estimates for greening the economy weren't our own. We just looked at a bunch of different estimates, and just, some people had the timeline of 20 years, so we should have changed that to 10 and so on. Some people had like partial greening, so we had to increase it to something like 100%. One thing I will say is that I'm not attached to these numbers, right? Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty when you're doing something like this. So yes, I'm going to show you some numbers, but the numbers are going to be imperfect, right? What is more important here is the methodology rather than the numbers themselves, right? I mean, you can do your own estimates, right? And you might come up with your own different numbers. The key here is the methodology, the MMT methodology, and how it's different from the mainstream. So we basically took the top 3 average because they were much, much higher than the other numbers there. And then we also subtracted how much we are currently spending on fossil fuels, right? So use of resources and a source of resources. So you're taking the net cost of greening the economy. And all of this is as a percentage of GDP, and the work was done earlier, so it's 2017 GDP. Now, universal health care. So here is a graph, and you probably can't read the countries at the bottom. These are all OECD countries, and the graph shows how much they spend on healthcare. You don't need to read the bottom part to know what's that outlier there, right? It is us, it's the United States. So the amount we spend on healthcare is much, much higher than our peer nations, right? A percentage of GDP, that's right. So something like 17% at the time, and it was projected to just keep growing, 18, 19, and so on, right? And the next comparable country is Switzerland, and they're spending something like 12% of GDP, right? You could look at this and you could say, well, if we could have some kind of a universal healthcare system where we could lower our spending on GDP to the next highest level, right? 12%, Switzerland. So we would be taking out spending equivalent to 6% of GDP from the economy, right? So you're taking out spending rather than injecting it, even though you're changing who's paying for that spending, right? Instead of us paying for it, the private sector, whether it's firms paying for their share of health insurance and us paying for our share of health insurance and then paying all the co-pays and stuff. So instead of the private sector paying for the spending, now the government will be doing it, right? But the private sector wants to be doing that spending. So you're withdrawing all of that spending out of the economy. And you could just look at this and say, well, 6% of GDP, but we did not do that. We did a more conservative estimate, and we came up with something like 3.6% of GDP, right? So at least in the short term, 3.6% of GDP could be saved if we were to implement a universal healthcare system. You can see that that would be a conservative estimate. We would still be an outlier there. We would keep our status as that outlier there still, if that's what we're going for, but we would have all of that extra room for spending in the economy. The last one is the job guarantee, which would obviously be a source and a use of resources. If you count the financial cost and you add up, you're basically double counting, right? Because you could be using the job guarantee workers for your greening projects. Whether it's retrofitting houses or environmental cleanup or whatever it is that you want to use the workers for. So in financial terms, it's a cost, but in real terms, it's both a cost, it's a source of resources and a use of resources, because job guarantee workers can be employed for your other Green New Deal projects, okay? So in a way, you have to take the net cost of the job guarantee, not the total cost. You have to net things out. So The final table looks like this. Like I said, I'm not attached to the numbers. We can argue over those, debate them. But you can see that some of these numbers are going to enter our table with a positive sign. So those would be a use of resources like greening the economy, and others will have a negative sign because they're a source of resources, such as Medicare for all. And that number is 3.7%. I think I said 3.6. We added a line there for ending forever wars, so lowering our spending on the military, and it was kind of a conservative estimate of just 1% of GDP. And so you see that your net resource cost comes out to something like 1.3% of GDP, right? Not unrealistic, right? It's not the kind of spending that your economy could not accommodate. And if there is the expectation that the government is going to be investing this amount into the economy, that obviously the private sector will accommodate. They would increase the capacity to produce to accommodate this spending because that's going to be profitable for them. Okay. All right. Now I'll come back to how you can use taxation to withdraw that spending if you don't want to have any net impacts on the economy. But to the previous point, the capacity of our economy to produce is obviously not fixed. And what I have on this graph is the blue line is our forecast for potential GDP as of January 2007. So this is before the financial crisis. And then the red line is the actual GDP. And then the green line is our potential GDP forecast from January of 2019. So you see, when we don't use our productive capacity, we erode our productive capacity, which is what happened, right? We've had to estimate it down. Stephanie Kelton showed you that graph where we gradually estimated down our productive capacity. So if we had continued on that trajectory, right, and this is what this line here is for, right? If we had continued on that trajectory rather than sort of let our economy stagnate during the financial crisis and hence erode our productive capacity, we would be at a much different trajectory as far as our potential GDP goes, and hence would have a lot more room in the economy to accommodate more spending. So we can create resources. The economy's potential is not fixed. Now, we can also try to target bottlenecks, which is an important issue with the current inflation, as I showed this morning, and Michaela showed you later as well. We have certain sectors of the economy that are inflating before others, right? I mean, we see it very clearly, right? The semiconductors, for example, right? Or oil or other things that become a bottleneck and they create inflationary pressures before we reach sort of true full employment and a true full usage of resources. So there can be a lot of impediments and a lot of bottlenecks here, and policies should try to alleviate those, right? So again, if you just focus on finances, you're not going to solve these problems, right? You have to understand what the real constraints are and then use appropriate policy to solve those real constraints. What about taxes? So going back to Krugman's point that, well, you know, heterodoxy doesn't really help because you have to raise taxes one way or another. Doesn't matter if it's for paying for spending or if it's to create resource space. Well, it does matter how you view the role of taxes, because if you view taxes as just a pay for, then it doesn't really matter what kind of taxes you impose. The key or the goal is to raise revenue. But if you think about taxes as a tool to create room for more spending in the economy, then it does matter what kind of taxes you impose, right? So a financial turnover tax sounds great. I'm all for it, right? It probably will curb financial speculation, and that's a great thing. But if it's successful, it should not raise any revenue, right? That's one thing. And does it really create room for more spending in the economy? Probably not. Right? Or raising the marginal income tax rate from 37 to 39.6% as the Biden plan was to do, right? Is that really going to affect the consumption of the rich households that it's trying to target? Are they going to consume less because their tax rate might go up by a little bit? Probably not, right? So if you're going to tax the wealthy in a way to create more room for more spending in the economy, then you probably have to raise taxes much, much higher, right? I don't know, marginal income tax rate of 70%, 90%, which is what we had post-World War II. So you have to think of taxes in that particular way. Now, not saying these taxes are not important. They can be used to reduce inequality, to target the political power of the wealthy, and so on. But if that's what you're trying to do, you have to, design the taxes to do that, right? If you're trying to create resource space in the economy, you have to design taxes to do that. And so I'll come back to the question of taxes, well, no, I guess I'm going to talk about that now. I thought I had the slide later. So in our paper, we say, well, if you want to achieve the kind of tax that will actually target consumption, then unfortunately, you have to tax wages, because that's the kind of tax that will curtail consumption. But we don't want to do it like just a tax. We would rather do it as some kind of deferred compensation. What if you're going to have to raise taxes on workers, then you have to compensate them in the future in the form of, say, better Social Security payments. But the goal is not to pay for the Green New Deal, but to reduce aggregate demand in the present. So with that kind of payroll tax surcharge, if we needed to do that, and that's an if, and at the time we were writing the paper, it was definitely an if, because we did not have the sorts of inflationary pressures that we have today. So with that, the net resource cost would actually be negative 0.3% of GDP. And so, you would actually, it would be somewhat deflationary rather than inflationary. Again, I'm not attached to the estimates. Okay. Now, this deferred compensation is a nice segue into Keynes, because the approach that we have here is not novel. It's not new. In fact, it's very similar to what Keynes was trying to do in this little pamphlet or book, How to Pay for the War. And Keynes made a similar argument to what I was doing here. He argued that, well, okay, you have the war and you have to pay for it, or you have to find the resources to prosecute your war, right? And so you're producing a lot because you have, you need to produce a lot of weapons and so on. And a lot of your workers are now in the army. So you don't have, as many workers and so on. And of course, if you're producing more, then you're creating more income, right? But that income cannot be spent on civilian consumption, because there isn't enough of resources left for civilian consumption after whatever you devote to the war, right? Because what you're producing are not consumption goods. What you're producing are basically government goods, right? Things that only the government is going to buy, whether it's warplanes or, ammunition or, guns and stuff like that. So the question then is, how in that kind of an environment where incomes are going up because production is up, but there is not enough for civilian consumption, how do you prevent inflation in that kind of an environment? And he basically was arguing that we should avoid the mistakes of World War I, because he says during World War I, what happened is that incomes went up. We did not have a good national policy for preventing all of those incomes being consumed. And so what happened is people spent their income, but there wasn't enough real resources to buy. So what happened is prices went up and there was inflation. And that eroded all of the gains that workers made because of the booming economy, because of all of the production, right? Their incomes went up nominally, but in real terms, they couldn't get more goods because there wasn't enough goods available for consumption, right? So he was saying we should prevent the repeat of that, and we should kind of manage this war in a way where workers would come out on the other side better off than they were at the beginning of the war. So Keynes says then what we have to do is estimate how much output can we produce, mobilizing the resources that are underutilized, and importing. Something that I mentioned earlier as well, that imports increase the output that's available to you. And then we have to estimate how much of that is needed for the war. And the difference is what's left for civilian consumption. So then somehow you have to limit consumption spending to whatever is available for civilian consumption so as not to lead to inflation. So how do you do that? And he says there are three things you can do. You can tax that income away. because if you tax it away, then it cannot be spent. You can rely on voluntary savings, or you can engage in some kind of deferred compensation. You could also call it forced savings. So, taxes. Well, Keynes actually has a chapter there, or a whole passage, I don't remember which one it is, but it's about taxing the rich, right? He says, okay, if we were to tax all of the income of the rich, could that pay for the war, right? Could that create the real resource base necessary for that? And the answer is no, right? He says, even if we raised tax rates very, very high, it would not be sufficient, right? So taxing the rich is not going to be sufficient. Well, if you tax the rest of the population, then they're not better off than they were before the war, right? Because they are working, they're earning all this income, but you're taking it away. So then, you're not accomplishing what you set out to accomplish. So taxes, he says, okay, they have to play some role, but it cannot be the whole thing. The second part, voluntary savings, is what we relied on, he says, during World War I. And this is what led to inflation, because this only works if everybody does it, right? Because if some people save, but others don't, and they just spend their income and consume, then what happens is inflation. So those who were saving, right, the real value of their savings is now eroded, even though they were doing the right thing. So this is the kind of thing that requires collective action and will not work if you just let it to the people. It will be inflationary. So he says, if you allow for this to happen, then what's going to happen is that firms are going to get the extra profits, right? So they're going to get all of that extra income as profits, and they're going to pay a portion of that as taxes. So they're going to act as tax collectors, he says, for the government, right? You don't tax the people, but all of that income goes to the firms, and then you tax the firms, at least a portion of that. So it's going to, end up taxed anyway. And obviously, if there's inflation, workers are going to demand higher wages, and wages will play catch up with prices, right? So then you get into this sort of price wage spiral situation. Okay. The last option, he says, is deferred compensation. And this is Keynes's plan. This is the plan that he tried to sell to the government there. And he was somewhat successful because the UK did implement it. And this is a certificate of post-war credit. As you can see, that's the deferred compensation plan. So this works basically like for savings, as I said. So you are going to take some of the people's income, and then after the war, you're going to return it to them with some interest. Okay, so it's like a savings account, right? And it works like a tax in a way. So you take it away today, but you are going to return it with some interest. Okay, so they're going to pay it together with their taxes, but then they get these certificates, which they can get after the war. And he says this is actually doubly beneficial, because not only are you withdrawing spending from the economy today, but you're also returning income to people after the war, at which time the government is going to be withdrawing its spending from the economy. So, after the war, the expectation was that there is going to be a slump. In the US, there was the fear that you're going to go into the Great Depression again, because all of the government spending would be withdrawn from the economy. So Keynes says this would actually avoid that, right? You would avoid the slump, because you give income to people at the time when they can spend, because there is the productive capacity to produce consumption goods, and so you prevent, a recession, basically. Now, it was implemented. It wasn't implemented very well. There were some problems with it, but it was implemented in a small scale in the US. In the UK. So our plan for deferred compensation, which I mentioned, where you tax workers today and you give them more Social Security in the future, that's modeled after Keynes's deferred compensation plan here. All right. Now, to summarize, Keynes's approach, or our approach, the MMT approach, is very similar to Keynes's approach. And I think this is because MMT is focused on real resources, right? And Keynes is writing about the war, and a war is a time when your real resources are really limited, right? And you understand that that's really the limit to your ability to spend. So times of crisis like war eliminate things about the real economy, eliminate things about how the economy works. Just like, World War I, basically was a game changer for Keynes' thinking about the economy. And here's World War II. It changes or it validates that view of how the economy works, right? And so MMT's approach is sort of saying that this is how the economy works, and so the focus should be on resources rather than finances and money. All right. Now, what did we do, of course, after COVID, after we spent $5 trillion in 1 year? We said, well, why don't we spend more on something called Build Back Better? And the original plans, there were two parts to it, the social infrastructure and then, traditional infrastructure bills. And they added to about $4.1 trillion over 8 years. So 8 years, $4.1 trillion. We have $5 trillion that we spent in 1 year. So, you would be spending something like $0.5 trillion a year, right? Not that much. Well, what do we say? We say, but how are we going to pay for it, right? That's the first question that is asked, and the answer is taxes. We have to start taxing, or we have to, change our taxes to pay for it, so that raising the marginal tax rate from 37 to 39.6, that was part of the plan. There was something about capital gains taxes and so on and so forth, right? That was the approach, and ultimately, of course, the Build Back Better didn't pass. And I mean, I can't say it's because of the pay for approach, but probably it might have contributed to it. Who knows? All right. So 8 years of spending paid over 15 years of taxes, right? Now, as an MMTer, you look at that and you say, well, that's very silly. You're going to be injecting spending over 8 years, but you want to withdraw spending 7 more years after that 8 years of spending has been spent, right? That makes zero sense. So you also try to match revenue, right, with the spending. But just because you're matching revenue with spending doesn't mean that you have the real resources there to, accommodate that spending, right? Because if you're taxing people who are not going to change their consumption decisions because of your taxes, such as the very rich, then you are not creating a real resource base in the economy for more spending. And the bigger problem is that this pay-for approach to spending shortchanges both objectives, right? You say, well, how much do we need to spend? You don't say, how much do we realistically need to spend to achieve a green economy in 10 years? Because if you do that, then the answer is 5% of GDP per year. It's not 500 billion a year, right? Total, whatever, all of the things that was included. It's 5% of GDP per year. That's how much you need to spend. Instead, the approach is, well, how much revenue can we raise, right? If we sort of cobble together the different tax increases, how much revenue can we raise? And that's how much then you end up spending, which is a backward way of doing it. At the same time, if you're trying to achieve a more equal distribution of income, right, which is what you're using your taxes for, then again, this approach is wrong, because you're not imposing, or you're not changing taxes in a way to affect income inequality. You're just changing taxes, what's sort of palatable and how much, do we need to engage in this kind of spending that we've kind of cobbled together. So it shortchanges both objectives. I think it was Elizabeth Warren who said, well, we're not raising taxes that much. It's not really gonna, the rich aren't gonna really feel it, right? It's not too much. Well, if that's what you're doing, then you're doing it wrong, right? If the goal is to address income inequality. All right, so I'm going to conclude, because I want to leave time for questions and answers. The MMT approach, which I think has been validated during the pandemic, is that financing demand should not be the problem. You can always create more demand. It can always be financed through public money. What the real question should be is, what should that money buy? And can we do that? Is there real stuff to buy? And so our framework for analyzing the cost of the Green New Deal and whether it's affordable is actually useful for evaluating its affordability, unlike this financial approach, which just adds the cost together and comes up with a number like $93 trillion. That tells you nothing about the real resource side of things. And I think one other lesson from the pandemic is that the government isn't just there to compensate for a downfall in demand during recessions, right? Because that's the only way we use fiscal policy anymore, right? Which say, well, in a recession, we're just going to have to sort of add more stimulus to come out of the recession and so on and so forth. Instead, it showed us that if we want to say develop a vaccine in a very short period of time, well, the government can help with that, right? Well, if we take that approach to policy, what else can we achieve, right? And so there's a quote from Keynes where he says, we can snatch from the exigency of war positive social improvements and advance towards economic equality greater than any which we have made in recent times. And I think the Green New Deal promises that kind of an outcome as well. You just have to approach it, I would argue, from an MMT perspective to understand its true affordability and the true constraints. So what are the true constraints? What are the imaginary constraints? It's very important to distinguish between the two, because then you can really make conclusions about the affordability of spending programs. All right, I'll stop right here and see if you have any questions for me. Do you need the microphone? I'm good. Okay. I'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time so that you don't have to go back.
Okay. Hi, thank you. So to what extent could restricting private credit creation serve as an offset? And if so, what is the best way of doing it? Because, it can be unpopular. There isn't like the perfect, way of doing it necessarily, which won't cause some people to be upset by not being able to get credit for the things they want.
We collect some questions. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. First of all, my question is how should we regard externalities such as carbon emissions and resource use in the Green New Deal as a limiting factor? Because obviously, the greening of the economy requires extensive use of rare metals with huge environmental impacts, and how should we integrate that concern in the whole Green New Deal / MMT discussion?
Ooh. Well, you handed it to me, so might as well ask mine. I'm going to take my mask off because I have to ask it this way. So kind of connected to his question too, in a way, like, what do you think the role that like immigration and desegregational policies would play in the Green New Deal? Because on the material science aspect, I've been talking with people that look at nuclear space mining as what they're 1,000 years down the line. Like the Western Anglophone countries have already got to lift up. So when it comes to the fact that our materials might run out, what do we do about policies like that when it comes to the fact that other countries are clearly going to have an upshot on like that resource capability?
So on the question of credit, restricting credit, I would say it's probably a good idea to have some credit controls, right? And we can sort of debate about what kind of credit controls and, what kind of, what parts of the financial sector, in a way, should we downsize? So I think some people like Nathan Tankus have talked about downsizing the financial sector as a non-fiscal pay for spending, because our financial sector is obviously oversized, right? And all of the resources, some of my best students go into the financial sector. I would say that's a real resource drain in a way, away from the kind of problems that we need to solve and toward finance. So, definitely policies that would downsize the financial sector, and credit controls could be part of that, could be, I think, useful in sort of as a non-fiscal pay for or non-financial pay for, right, for the Green New Deal. On the question of resources that you need to green the economy, right? I mean, so I would say, well, what's the alternative, right? Because currently we're doing that. We're using fossil fuels, and we are using it without sort of any end in sight, that we're just going to continue doing it. Now, I would say there are good ways to green the economy and bad ways. All of us owning Teslas, I don't think that's a good way to accomplish it, right? Because, I mean, the US is based really on private transportation, and that's not an ideal way to do it, right? If you had more public transit, then it would be sort of a less costly way in resource terms of achieving the same kind of goal. Now, is that politically feasible, right? I mean, in a sort of a society that is built around cars, I don't know. I mean, I'll put that on my wish list too, I guess, with all the other things that I've already put there, right? So yeah, that would be my answer. Now, on the question of developing countries, I remember asking this exact same question because I am from a developing country many years ago. Somebody did this presentation about, well, we need to sort of, limit consumption and do this and that. I was like, well, what about all of us? Because you've gotten to enjoy all the benefits, right? And what about the rest of us? So I would say definitely the developed nations have to help the developing nations, pay for, even if it's in real resource terms or in terms of technology and so on, for trying to achieve a greener economy. Now, I would say all of us probably will have to limit our consumption, whether it's developed or developing nations, right, in a way, because it's just not sustainable. And if we all said, well, I want to achieve whatever standard of living you have achieved, right? I mean, yeah, but is that just going to be feasible in sort of an environment that is constrained? Now, I would say trying to sort of lower the amount of inputs through better technology, so increasing our productivity using less and less inputs, right? Again, I don't think Tesla has accomplished that necessarily, given how much battery, right, they use and all of this, all of that. So that's also important. So the new technologies, and that's where I would say the state can play a role, right? Like that's why I mentioned the COVID vaccines. We developed them in no time, basically, right? So if we could throw all that money on all the other problems that we're facing, maybe we could solve a bunch of other problems that we think are unsolvable. Right?
Immigration, segregation. That's why I'm saying to you, like, what's the role that is where you want to get to leave that came from our country? Wow, but what's the role of like immigration policies? Like, you need these federal bases to come live here, be part of this country.
Yeah.
You think that there's a role of segregation?
Yeah. Well, so in the question of immigration, right? I mean, obviously, from a real resource perspective, it's a benefit for the US if we get more workers. But for the countries where the workers are leaving from, I don't know if that's the best for those particular countries. So I would say empowering those countries to create the kinds of policies where people don't want to leave. Because I don't know, maybe some people will still want to leave, but a lot probably won't if they're economic immigrants, right? If you had a job guarantee, if you had MMT style policies that I argue would help those countries develop in a more inclusive way, then I don't know if they would want to leave, right? In a way, it's a resource drain for those countries. And yes, the US is benefiting from that, even though it's not acknowledged, right? But that's what I would say. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation. So from the macro level, I think it's extremely insightful and really, really helpful. I'm wondering if there's any research on more like an industrial organization level, like just one level below, because obviously like, I mean, during the war also, there was just a lot of planning and like rationing and stuff. And I just wonder, how are you going to achieve this within capitalism, sort of, where a lot of the investments that have to be made into these technologies, into, like greening the economy have to come from the private sector. And I mean, also right now, the argument usually is, let's leverage all this private, money that's just lying around and has nothing productive to invest in, instead invested in financialization. Let's, give them like a subsidy so that please, they will like, pay a little bit for this park here or something, like that's how it's currently going. That's how currently like government spending is used. So I'm wondering, is there a way to like force that private money to go into the things that we want it to go into? Or like, what's the MMT answer for how to deal with this money that's just laying around and doing damage, basically?
In World War II, the United States followed some of Keynes's recommendations on how to pay for the war, but not all of them. In particular, the United States did not implement a policy of involuntary savings, that is mandatory deferred compensation. Instead, the U.S. relied on voluntary savings, such as the war bonds program, which were sold to the public on a very patriotic basis, but also on the basis that that was paying for the war. And we understand that it really wasn't paying for the war. It was freeing up resources. It was diverting consumption. It was both diverting consumption and shifting it forward into the future. Have you thought about what the political messaging would be to encourage people to support a program of involuntary saving or either voluntary or involuntary saving, but without resorting to the rhetoric of that this is paying for the Green New Deal? Do you have any thoughts on how that might be accomplished?
So if I recall correctly, Keynes's primary opposition to the voluntary savings policy was basically that it wasn't going to be enough. And that was probably true in the context of a government deficit of 30% of GDP in the US, at least during World War II. But if you're talking about net resource uses of only 1% of income, I mean, you could ask people to save 1 or 2% of their income, and they can do it. And there's another MMT antecedent, Beardsley Rummel, who I think came up earlier in the week, who actually was quite a proponent of voluntary savings policies during the war, argued that there's quite a few benefits actually from voluntary saving. There's like social benefits, like building greater trust between the government and their people by asking them to directly help out in this emergency. And he talks about like you can get the churches involved who have historically supported thrift and like those kinds of things. So I guess my question is, voluntary saving, it seems much more feasible in this. So do you think that's something we can do?
Question of evolving private finance. I think especially European heterodox economists seem sort of enamored with this idea that we're going to somehow we have to make the private sector kind of do the right thing, Yeah, I'm not a big believer in that, right? I'm more like, okay, if you want to downsize finance, then you need particular policies for that. Okay, financial transaction tax, use that if you want to downsize finance. If you want to break up the big banks, that's what you need to work on. If you want to limit how big they can grow, that's what you sort of need to concentrate on. I mean, just like incentivizing the private money to do the right thing. Sure, I mean, you can, I think that can definitely be part of the program. I mean, you mentioned capitalism and then you mentioned World War II. Well, we did fight World War II under a capitalist system. And in case of the US, it's amazing how much they relied on the private sector, even during World War II. Yes, we had the National Planning Board and a bunch of other sort of organizations that were created and then dismantled trying to deal with that. Yes, they sort of would like do a resource accounting, right? How much steel do we need? Do we have enough? And then if not, what do we do? That kind of stuff. And I think they tried to sort of rely on the private companies like car makers. They thought, okay, with enough incentives, they will stop producing cars and instead they will produce planes. And then they realized, well, no, they're not doing it. So then they had to force them to do it in a way. So yeah, we did it, we can do it, but we can't do it without some kind of strategic planning. So I think we do need some kind of strategic planning, because you do need to do some kind of resource accounting at a more micro level, right? Because what I've done is very macro. I mean, the resources released, like workers, will not be necessarily appropriate for the kind of resources that you need. So you do have to do training, you do have to do some kind of planning, although that word is kind of, you can't say that, right? That's part of those words that you can't say, at least in the US context. So that needs to be done. The question of war bonds, right? I mean, I don't know if you say, let's not spend so that we can fight climate change, at least half of the population is gonna be like, you know what, I'm gonna spend even more because, you know, I don't believe in climate change. So I don't know if that messaging would work in the current environment, because we, not everybody sees climate change as the sort of the kind of enemy that we saw during World War II that we needed to fight. On the question of messaging around, you know, bonds and so on, yeah, I mean, I don't really have a good answer for that. I would say curtail your consumption, because, you know, we need to save the future for future generations. I mean, we say that all the time from financial perspective, right? We say, well, we gotta, you know, we can't spend too much for our grandchildren. Why not do the same thing for real resources? Like, use less today to save for your grandchildren, that kind of thing. I don't know, it will fly. Like I said, for half of the population or whatever percentage, you're probably gonna say, you know what, I'm gonna buy a second truck, or I don't know. The last question, yes. So the 1.3%, right? It's not a big number, but like I said, how reliable are those numbers? I mean, I'm not gonna sort of, you know, go to bat for that, right? I don't know. Maybe we are going to need more for greening the economy, especially since our timeline is getting shorter and shorter, right? There is that problem there. I mean, if it was really just 1.3%, right? Like I said, I think the private sector, you might not even need the saving, right? Because the private sector could increase capacity, because there is this expectation of all this spending over the next 10 years. It's not like one and done thing, right? So I don't know if that's the kind of spending that the economy cannot accommodate, even as is, right? And if we didn't have the supply chain problems, right, I would more confidently say that we might not even need the payroll tax surcharge. That's like sort of, that's used to show that if you want to use taxes as pay-fors, then you have to sort of think about them differently. So that you know, that's more for that. But yeah.
We touched on this a bit, but I'm wondering if anyone, you know of anyone who has run, or you have yourself run a calculation of how much demand we could release by sort of vastly reducing the finance sector, kind of in terms of releasing, like a lot of those people have engineering backgrounds that could be used for like battery storage, like taking existing easy battery storage technologies and bringing them to market. I'm curious kind of what your thoughts are on that.
So thank you. Just a quick question as a following of the other is that what place do you offer to carbon tax and like more real constraints against the private sector? Because it's linked also to the other sessions of this week. I have the feeling that, okay, with a green MMT monetary framework, we could self-finance our economy while with a currency issuing, etc. But it doesn't imply that the private sector, and especially the brown and fossil private sector, will decarbonize itself, even with interest rate differentiation between brown assets, green assets, etc. But it doesn't imply that the real productive capital, like machines, like factories, will green themselves, even with the MMT monetary framework. So what place do you offer to like direct planning and productive constraints against the private sector?
Thank you. I think I have two questions. You said the load of the tax is to reduce demand in order to reduce the inflationary pressure on the overall economy. What kind of the tax is appropriate to reduce the demand? Indirect tax, such as the consumption tax, is useful. It's my first question. And the second question, if that kind of the indirect tax is too high, that will, lead to the shrinking economy, right? And so, that will make the economy shrink, and that will also could have the also bad effect on especially on the poor people. So, like, how do you decide a tax rate in order to like balance the demand and the supply? Yeah.
But it's more regressive than, say, a more income. Consumption tax is more regressive, right, than more of an income tax. And you said it will shrink the economy, but that's the whole point, right? That you're trying to reduce spending because you're going to be injecting it from like other directions. So that's really the point of taxes in this way. Keynes talks about it too. He says, well, how do we structure this tax and the involuntary savings and so on, where we don't hit the poor people in a hard way, because we don't want to do that. So then he has some plan for like a more progressive approach and of how to do it, like exempt the really low income people. And then of course the deferred compensation is a way where you take away but you return it at some future date with interest, right? So it's not really a tax, it's more of a savings account. On question of finance and whether downsizing finance, if there have been some estimates, I know Nathan Tankas has like a whole report. I haven't read the whole thing on non-fiscal pay-fors, and I assume it figures largely in that report, because that's what the paper is about non-fiscal pay-fors such as downsizing finance. And so you can look into that. Now, on question of carbon tax, obviously, one thing that I said is that you do need to do other things to lower the inputs, for example, right? Whether it's technology and so on, or disincentivize certain behaviors. That's one other approach for taxes, right? So Bursley Rummel, he says that, one of the roles of taxes is to lower spending, but the other one is to discourage certain behaviors. I don't know, smoking, drinking soda, or in Europe, it's been used for a long time to try to get to more efficient cars, right? Tax on gasoline, which is much, much more expensive there. So, rules where cars have to be much more efficient, which the Obama administration sort of imposed, and then Trump came and sort of got rid of them. Sure, I'm all for all of that. I'm all for carbon tax. I just don't like when people say, well, carbon tax is going to save us. I don't think it will, right? Can it be part of the package? Obviously, but it's not going to be sort of the main solution. That's how I view it. Okay. So I'll end here. I'll be around, and I'm doing a discussion session after this. So if you have any more questions, feel free to come by.